If she still has her mind, she'll find us. That's what Zach said, real low, right as he stepped away from the bench. He slid the words between a sip of coffee and the jingle of his keys. He didn't say goodbye, just gave Lauren a nod, and she sent me that tight little smile she usually saves for church greeters or neighborhood meetings. Then, just like that, they turned around and walked out of the station. They left me sitting there with a cup of chamomile tea, already lukewarm and barely steeped, and a paper bag that faintly smelt like banana bread. No phone, no train ticket, just that sentence, hanging in the air like it was still deciding what it meant. I didn't move for a long while. I sat so still that people started glancing over, probably wondering if I had nodded off or if something was wrong. But my eyes were open, my back was straight. I was raised by women who believed that posture meant strength, even when everything else around you was falling apart. My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 72. I used to run a yoga studio out in East Peoria. I baked sourdough twice a week and led the quilt auction at the public library every fall. I kept tidy spreadsheets, grew tomatoes in raised beds, even once planned a senior center trip to the state fair, complete with color-coded name tags and a cooler full of sandwiches. So no, I wasn't confused. But that seems to be the new version of the story, the one they're passing around, the one where I've somehow become someone who's better off somewhere quiet. I glanced around the Amtrak station. The overhead lights buzzed like far-off bees. Old posters curled at the corners on corkboards. Outside, the wind yanked at a flag I couldn't quite see. Inside, the heater pushed out a kind of heat that made my skin itch and slowed down my thoughts. I reached into my coat pocket. My fingers brushed over an old lip balm, a folded-up grocery list, and something small and smooth. A recorder. Black. I'd clipped it on that morning to remind myself of a recipe I was listening to. I'd completely forgotten it was there. Its red light was still blinking. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat there, watching people pass through the station, moving fast, distracted, not really seeing anything. Most of them didn't even glance at me, and the few who did gave that little half smile, the kind people save for the elderly or the fragile. Eventually, I stood. My knees creaked, but I didn't wobble. I made my way to the information desk, nodded at the teenager behind the glass, and asked him as calmly as I could, "May I borrow a pen?" He handed one over without even looking up. I found an old scrap of paper in my bag, the back of a flyer for a lost cat, and I started writing. Dates, names, the route Zach had suggested, the kind of tea Lauren always gives me when she's about to ask for something. Even the banana bread, its pale color, that too-sweet taste, like everything she does that seems kind, but always feels like control. I wrote down everything I could remember. Outside, snow had started to fall, big, lazy flakes drifting sideways in the wind. Inside, my tea had gone cold, but the recorder was still blinking. I didn't know where I was going to sleep that night. It wouldn't be home, not yet. I needed somewhere quieter, somewhere I could think. And I knew exactly who I was going to call when I got there. I know I'm not the only one who's been left behind with a quiet lie and a paper cup. Maybe yours didn't happen in a train station. Maybe it was in a living room. Or maybe it was just silence where a phone call should have been. If someone you loved ever made you feel small, especially after you carried them through their hardest years, I'd really like to hear your story, even if it's just a part of it. Leave me a comment if you've ever had to start again quietly. And if you're wondering where I went that night, the place I chose instead of home, well, Chapter 2 might surprise you. It wasn't loud, but it was mine. I didn't go home that night. I went to Walter's. The cabin was just outside Peoria, tucked between sleeping cornfields and one of those gravel roads that GPS always seems to miss. I hadn't called ahead. I didn't need to. Walter always kept the back porch light on. Some habits just outlast marriages, mortgages, and even good knees. When he opened the door, he didn't ask why I was there. He just stepped aside and said, "You still like lemon in your tea?" I nodded and brushed the cold off my sleeves. Inside, the old heater was humming like it had since the 80s. The place smelled like cedar and worn paperbacks. The couch creaked when I sat down, and without thinking, my hand found that little tear in the armrest, like it always did. Walter didn't press me. That was something I'd always appreciated about him. He could fix a carburetor blindfolded, but he'd never ask a woman why her hands were shaking. Sandra called just after 9. I'd left her a message 3 weeks back, just in case, though I didn't even remember doing it until I heard her voice. It was sharp and warm, exactly what I needed. She told me Zach and Lauren had tried to access my accounts, twice. I didn't even blink. I asked her what stopped them. She said it was me. That little bit of paperwork I'd filed last year had done the job, but she warned we had to move quickly. She'd already drafted the freeze documents. I told her to send them. I'd sign. Walter slid a mug of tea toward me with one hand and a legal pad with the other. He muttered something under his breath like, "What's mine is yours," and then sat across from me with a crossword puzzle I knew he'd never finish. Sandra and I went through everything. My will, my medical proxy, even the lease for the yoga studio I'd tucked away in the back of my filing cabinet. Turns out it was still in my name. That little studio on Main Street with the cracked windows and lavender walls, I still owned it. Lauren's banana bread was sitting in my bag, wrapped in foil. She'd left it on the kitchen counter that morning when I moved out, like it was some kind of peace offering, or maybe a bribe. I unwrapped it slowly. It smelled like nostalgia and fake vanilla. I took one bite. It was too sweet, overwhelming, just like everything she ever said on speakerphone. I chewed, swallowed, took another bite. Then I stood up, walked out to the porch, and tossed the rest into the bird feeder. The jays would like it. They always did. Walter raised an eyebrow, but didn't say a word. Instead, he leaned over and reached for the copy machine buried under a mess of extension cords. Then my phone buzzed. It was Sandra again. Her message read, "They've filed for emergency guardianship. Hearings in 2 weeks." I stared at the screen. My hands didn't shake. I looked up at Walter. He was already clearing the table. I told him, "It's time to make copies." And for the first time in weeks, my voice was steady. Lauren once told me that old people shouldn't live alone, so I left a recipe card in every drawer of that house. The driveway still looked the same, except now there was a little security camera tucked beneath the eaves. I acted like I didn't see it. My fingers slid along the iron railing as I went up the steps, 2 at a time, the way I used to when the bread was still warm in the oven and Zach was still just a boy. Lauren opened the door before I could even knock. She said, "We're so glad you're here," like it was something she'd practiced in the mirror. I told her I won't be long. The house smelled like vanilla candles mixed with something artificial, like a hotel trying too hard to feel like home. Everything was beige. Beige walls, beige pillows, beige life. It wasn't comfort. It was control. She told me to let her know if I needed anything, then quickly added that I shouldn't go upstairs because the railing was loose. She said it too fast, like the lie didn't quite fit her mouth. I gave her a small smile and said, "Of course." She hovered for a second, then slipped into the kitchen. I moved through the house slowly. Every corner held something I used to know, but now felt like a stranger. The cookie jar still looked like a cow, but now it held keys instead of oatmeal raisin cookies. The coat rack still leaned a little to the left. In the living room, I found the jam jar. It was tucked behind a stack of old photo albums. Inside were lavender seeds wrapped in parchment, held together with rubber bands. They were from my grandmother's garden. The last time I held them, Zach wasn't even tall enough to see out the window. He used to help me label them. I tucked them into my tote, next to a roll of measuring spoons and a tube of lip balm I didn't even remember owning. In the hallway closet, I left a sticky note inside the spine of Better Homes and Gardens pie recipes, just above the peach cobbler page. Next to the couch, on a little side table, there was a ceramic dish filled with paper clips and a USB drive shaped like a tulip. I didn't touch it, just brushed off a little dust and left it right there. Lauren came back, her voice full of forced cheer. She asked if I wanted her to box up my winter clothes. I said I just needed the good scissors, the ones I bought in 2009. She blinked, just once, then gave me a smile that was too tight to be real. She told me they were probably in the garage. I said softly, "They never were." She handed me a stack of mail. Most of it was junk. One envelope had my name spelled wrong. Inside was a folded copy of the guardianship petition. My thumb ran across the crease. It hadn't been signed yet. I zipped my tote. Banana bread, recipes, seeds, a life in pieces. On the way out, I placed a recipe card on the kitchen counter. Banana cream pie. It was my handwriting, but the code in the corner wasn't from any cookbook. I made it up back in 1978. Outside, the sunlight hit the brass house number just right. I stood there a second longer than I needed to. Then I walked back to Walter's borrowed pickup and sent Sandra a text. I told her, "They're starting to panic. That's good." The thing about courtrooms is they all smell the same. Old carpet, cold coffee, and that kind of worry that sticks to the chairs like dust. I walked in 5 minutes early, not because I had to, but because I wanted them to see that I remembered the time. I wore my old library board pin on the lapel of my wool coat, small, brass, still polished. Zach was already sitting at that long plastic bench, fussing with the cuff of his blazer. He didn't look up when I passed, but Lauren did. Her eyes scanned from my shoes to my hair, like she was taking inventory. She was dressed like a consultant, tasteful, rehearsed, holding a folder tight against her chest like a clutch. When she smiled, it was the kind of smile people give stray dogs waiting outside a restaurant. Sandra arrived with the wind in her coat and purpose in her step. Her folder had color-coded tabs. Her blazer looked like it could cut through paper. She didn't say much, just nodded and sat next to me, flipping straight to a page labeled Contingencies. The hearing room felt smaller than I remembered. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The chairs creaked anytime someone shifted. Judge Holcomb looked like a man who gave up sugar and small talk a long time ago. He read names from a list. Mine was last. Lauren spoke first. She talked about me losing my keys, about the time I called a neighbor Alice when her name was Marlene, about how I left the stove on once, back in 2020. She looked at me with just enough concern to sound caring and just enough pity to sound right. It was all carefully done, like a performance wearing a mother's voice. Then Sandra stood up. She said, "With your permission, Your Honor," and pressed play on a small recorder. The red light blinked, and then Zach's voice came through. It was muffled, but you could hear it clear as day. He said, "If she still has her mind, she'll find us." The room didn't gasp, but everyone listened. Sandra handed over our financial records, the yoga studio's paperwork, a notarized lease agreement with my name printed in bold. I watched Lauren's fingers twitch. Zach still wouldn't meet my eyes. Judge Holcomb didn't give a ruling right away. All he said was, "There's no emergency here." He underlined that word, like it meant more than just timing. Then he looked at me and added, "This matter is continued. We'll reconvene in 60 days. It wasn't a win, but it felt like a breath. And for now, that was enough. Outside, the winter air stung my cheeks. The sidewalk was covered in old salt and something that felt like anticipation. Lauren caught up with me near the courthouse steps. Her voice was low and sharp. She said, "This isn't over." I turned toward her, steady and calm. I said, "I know. That's why I'm still standing." She blinked, just once, then walked away, her heels loud against the stone. Sandra came up beside me a moment later. She handed me a copy of the judge's note and said, "You did well." I folded the paper and slipped it into my coat pocket. Then I looked up at the gray sky and said, "Time to make better use of the days." I keep the blue one, the cup with the tiny crack just under the rim. It never leaked, it just held heat better. Maybe that's why I liked it. It wasn't perfect, but it never gave up. The knock on the door wasn't loud, just a soft, uncertain tap. When I opened it, Zach was standing there with a grocery bag in one hand and the other shoved deep in his coat pocket. He said, "Thought you might want dinner," without meeting my eyes. I asked, "Store-bought?" but I already knew. He gave me a small smile and said, "Well, it's the thought, right?" I let him in. The apartment still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. I hadn't unpacked everything yet, just the basics. A couch, a kettle, and one box in the corner, marked kitchen, still taped shut. I told him I had tea, already reaching for that old wooden drawer where the cups have always lived. There were 3 of them, just like before, blue, yellow, and green. He used to fight over the green one with his sister when they were little, called it his good luck cup. I set them on the table. He chose the green one again, but this time I noticed his fingers trembled slightly as he held the handle. He asked, "You still drink chamomile?" I said, "Only on days that end in Y." He didn't laugh. We poured. We sipped. The silence wasn't heavy, not yet, just familiar, like sitting next to someone in church you once loved but no longer had words for. He glanced around and said, "This place is nice, cozy." I told him, "It's temporary." Zach nodded, then asked, "So, do you still have the studio lease?" The question sounded too casual, like someone asking if you still kept old love letters, knowing they used to mean something. I looked him in the eye and asked, "Do you remember who taught you to fold towels that neat?" He blinked and said, "Mom." I cut in gently. "It was your grandmother. She had rules. Fold in thirds. Always." Zach looked down at his cup, then back at me. "Lauren's just scared," he said. "She thinks you're—" He stopped. I finished it for him. "Old? Forgetful? Weak?" He said, "No," but the word came too slow to believe. His hand jerked a little when he reached for the sugar bowl. It knocked his cup off balance. Tea spilled across the table in a soft crescent, soaking into the wood. He muttered, "Damn, sorry." I handed him a napkin. It was folded in thirds. He didn't say anything after that. When he left, I stood at the door a little longer than I needed to, not to watch him go, just to hear the hallway settle again. Back inside, I saw the casserole still sitting on the counter. He'd forgotten it. Or maybe he hadn't. I peeled back the foil. It was still warm. Tucked between the plastic lid and a folded paper towel was a small slip of paper. 12 digits, scribbled in his messy handwriting, not a phone number. I held it up to the light, my hand steady as ever. Something was shifting, something quiet, and I wasn't done folding. The gas station on 3rd still prints receipts on that thin paper, the kind that fades if you leave it in the sun. I've got a shoebox full of them, folded, sorted, dated. Lauren once told me old people lose things, so I started keeping everything they left behind. I placed the folder on Sandra's desk. It was labeled in black ink, just one word, incidental. At first glance, nothing inside looked important. A receipt for printer ink, a photo of Zach at the bank, a printed email that started with "per our conversation," but never said who the conversation was with. Sandra adjusted her glasses and started flipping through the pages. She said, "This is extensive." I told her, "I know."
There were sticky notes, pharmacy printouts, and even a coupon for organic granola that expired 3 years ago. She smiled faintly at that, but the smile disappeared when she reached the signature page. It was a document titled Yoga Studio Asset Transfer. The name on the line said Margaret Odell, but the loops in the G and the tail of the double L didn't look like mine. Close, but not close enough. I told her, I never signed that, and I certainly didn't do it on February 12th. Sandra turned to the attached timestamp.
She said, "That's the same day you were in physical therapy." I nodded. "Walter brought me peanut butter cookies." Lauren wrinkled her nose and called them gas station food. Sandra tapped her pen against her legal pad. Then she said, "We could request the clinic's logs, entry times, provider sign-ins, surveillance footage." I said, "I already did." I handed her the envelope. Inside was a time-stamped sign-in sheet, my name, my therapist's signature, the exact hour I was being told to breathe through the stretch, while someone else was pretending to be me. Sandra looked at the photo of Zach. It was taken through a bank window. He was standing beside Lauren, holding a folder, probably the one with that fake signature. She leaned back in her chair and said, "We can make this criminal." I didn't flinch. Then she added, a little softer, "But it's your call." I turned to look out the office window. Across the street, a woman was helping her mother out of a rideshare, one hand on the door, the other steadying her mother's elbow. That's care, not control, just care. I said, "No, we make it clear, not loud." Sandra looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. She pulled a new folder from her drawer. It was crisp, empty, labeled in thick black ink, Restoration Plan. She said, "I'll get started tonight." We didn't need drama. We needed light, receipts, records, quiet proof. I picked up my folder and got ready to leave. Right as I reached the door, Sandra asked, "What made you start collecting all this?" I looked back at her and said, "Because memory fades, ink fades, but pattern stays." I left her office and walked 2 blocks to the diner, the one with the cracked red booths and the waitress who calls everyone hun. I slid into my usual seat, ordered a coffee, and pulled out a napkin. On it, I wrote the date, the weather, and a thought. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's documentation. And if any part of this feels familiar to you, if you've ever had to smile through something that broke your heart just to keep the peace, I hope you'll leave me a comment. I'd love to know if you've been there too. If you're still with me, maybe follow along. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but now that I've started, I think I need to finish it. Next time I finally open a door I was told to leave shut, and what I find inside, let's just say it doesn't stay quiet for long. Have you ever kept a secret just to protect someone who didn't deserve it? Tell me, I'm listening. Some people leave a mess behind when they go. Lauren never did. She folds guilt like laundry. Neat corners, tight seams, nothing sticking out. I saw the photo online. It was from one of those charity accounts. The caption said, "Generous donation today from a lovely young woman helping a senior family member transition." In the background, there was a pile of clothes, beige sweaters, a wool coat I hadn't seen since winter, and right there in the middle, just barely visible, a corner of fabric with small blue thread. I leaned in. It was my apron, the one with my initials, the one I wore every Thursday for 30 years. For banana bread, overflowing cups of cinnamon, flour on my elbows. Lauren gave it to me our first Christmas together. She used to smile more back then. I didn't cry. I just got in the car. The donation center was at the edge of East Peoria, right between a strip mall and a payday loan place. The sky was low and gray, like it hadn't quite decided on a season. Inside, a woman behind the desk looked up and asked if she could help me. I told her the truth. I said, "I think something that belongs to me might have been dropped off by mistake."
She smiled and said, "Go on back. If you recognize it, you're welcome to take it." I walked through the racks and bins like I was moving through my own attic. And then I saw it, folded too tight, the label covered with masking tape, still warm from the laundry press. I picked it up and walked out. No one stopped me. That evening, I laid it out on the kitchen table. The blue thread was still there, faint but holding. I unpicked it slowly, and with red thread, something louder, I stitched my initials again. The stitches were a little shaky, but they held. Later, I pulled down the old recipe box. It still smelled like nutmeg and thyme. I typed each one out slowly. Zucchini bread, lentil soup, chocolate crinkle cookies. The handwritten notes became soft clicks on the keyboard. Names turned into file names. Scribbles in the margins turned into metadata. Then I created a folder and uploaded everything to a shared drive. I named it Still Mine. I wasn't sure if I felt angry or just tired, maybe both. But when I finished, I sent the link to Sandra and to one more address, an old one. I don't even know if it still works. The subject line just said, "Just in case." Before bed, I folded the apron and placed it in the drawer next to the spoons. Red thread facing up. Erasure doesn't always come loud. It doesn't always mean fire or shouting. Sometimes it comes neatly folded in a bag marked donations. But I still know what's mine, and I've just started to remember how to keep it. Doug built that shelf with crooked nails and way too much wood glue. He called it rustic. I called it stubborn. But it held for 36 years, right there on the landing between the window and the closet that always stuck in summer. They never moved the plants. That's how I knew they didn't really live there, not the way roots live in soil. They were just squatting in someone else's story, shifting the furniture around and pretending it was theirs. I showed up on a Sunday morning, just before the church bells rang. No warning, no call. The porch light was flickering, same as always when the weather turned. The paint was chipped at the corner of the rail where I used to lean while waiting for packages. The door opened slower than I remembered. Zach answered. He looked like someone caught halfway through a sentence. His shirt was wrinkled, his socks didn't match. He said, "Mom?" I said, "Yes." I stepped inside. He didn't stop me. The house was still beige, but colder now. It smelled like new candles, trying too hard to smell like old ones. The furniture hadn't moved, but something about it felt off. I said, "I'm just grabbing something," and headed for the stairs. He said, "They said you shouldn't." But I didn't wait. The hallway upstairs was a different color. My sewing chest, the one with the brass corners, was gone. New pictures hung on the wall, but none with faces. Doug's shelf was still there, tilted slightly left, just like always. The planter was gone, but the little lavender sachet was still taped to the underside. It had yellowed, but it was still there. I pulled it down gently. Inside was a small key and a folded sheet of paper. The affidavit from 2017, signed, notarized, but never filed. Back then, I thought it was dramatic to plan for betrayal. Zach had followed me upstairs. He leaned against the doorframe, quiet, until I turned. He said, "She said you wouldn't remember." I looked right at him, not through him, not past him. I said, "That's the thing about memory. It's not always loud, but it lasts longer than you think." He didn't argue. Back downstairs, I placed the paper in my bag. Across the street, the neighbor was watering a potted fern. She waved without saying a word. I stepped off the porch and paused on the last step. I said, "Tell her the shelf remembers too." Then I walked back to my car. The key was warm in my hand, and the paper lay folded flat in my coat. Some people try to erase you with noise. Others do it with neatness. But there are still corners in every house where the truth tucks itself in and waits. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, sealed with pressed lavender wax. It looked like something from another century, proper, deliberate, just like me. When someone sends you a letter by hand delivery, you know it's not a thank you note. Sandra turned it over slowly. Her brow was already furrowed before she even broke the seal. Walter had brought it to her that morning, right to her office door. No explanation, just a nod. He didn't even take off his coat. He said, I told him, only give it to her when I say go, and I'd said go the night after the shelf. She slid the papers out like they were made of glass, a list of assets, all in my handwriting, witnesses, a timeline, proof I still owned the studio, banking records, copies of texts, and a summary of the guardianship challenge, the one they filed and then tried to quietly undo. At the end was a formal request, restoration of autonomy and civil investigation, just as outlined under Illinois Statute 11A-20. No drama, just law and lavender wax. That afternoon, I hosted something I called a wellness workshop at the East Peoria Public Library. Small meeting room, folding chairs, lemon water in a plastic pitcher. No microphones, just me. A few women came, some older, some not. One of them I recognized from Lauren's book club posts. Another gave me a look like she already knew too much. I didn't talk about my daughter. I didn't mention guardianship or courtrooms. I talked about documents, about naming your own power of attorney while your hand is still steady, about making sure your name is on the title, about writing things down before someone else decides to write your story for you. Heads nodded, pens came out of purses. One woman whispered, "My niece did something like that," then let her voice fade. I passed around a simple checklist, plain paper, no logo. I told them to keep it somewhere dry. Sandra had helped me format it just right. Back at her office, she'd already started the paperwork. Tabs in place, printouts clipped. The restoration plan was open on her desk, the wax seal pressed flat under a paperweight. She didn't ask if I was sure. We were beyond that. She just said, "Signature goes here." My hand didn't shake. I signed the motion, guardianship reversal, civil investigation request. I wrote my full name, Margaret Louise Corbin, just like I did on my library board badge, just like I always did on every recipe card I gave away. Not loud, but real. When we were done, Sandra folded the papers with care. No speeches, no big moment, just two women doing exactly what needed to be done. I left with my scarf tucked in and a borrowed umbrella under my arm. The sky was soft gray, the kind that makes the whole world feel like it's holding its breath. I didn't speak in the elevator, didn't hum, didn't fidget, but just before I reached the front doors, I whispered, more to the air than to myself, "They'll never call me forgetful again."
And if you've ever had to quietly fight for something that was yours all along, then you already know how heavy my bones feel tonight. Tell me, has anyone ever tried to rewrite your story before you were done living it? I'd love to know I'm not the only one. Leave me a note and stay close, because what happens next? Some truths don't stay folded forever. I hadn't touched that key in months, but my hand found it without even looking. The brass was warm from sitting in my pocket, and when I slid it into the lock at the old yoga studio, the chimes above the door gave that soft, familiar sound. Same as always. Not louder, not sadder, just steady. They called the place abandoned, but you can't abandon something that still remembers you. The guest book was still on its pedestal, open to a page where someone had drawn a heart around the words, "Thank you, M." There was dust, sure, but even dust knows how to wait. Sandra met me inside. She wasn't wearing her usual blazer, just a cardigan and flats, like she understood that the building didn't need law today, it needed kindness. She said, "Lease is clear. Insurance is inactive but revivable. You've got the green light, Margaret." I nodded. I didn't say thank you, not because I wasn't grateful, but because we both understood. This wasn't about paperwork. It was about remembering the shape of something that used to be mine. The mats were still tucked in their racks, name tags pinned to the corners with faded ink.
Mine was still there too, Mama M, a nickname I used to roll my eyes at. Now it felt like a thread keeping me stitched together. The morning sun came in through the east windows. I stood in the middle of the room, breathing in the scent of cork, lavender oil, and thyme. There was a soft knock from the open door. Lily. She used to come twice a week, before the twins. She looked older now, tired but grounded. She said, "I heard you were back," then held up a grocery bag. "Figured you'd need tea, or trash bags." We didn't hug. We just got to work. Dusting, wiping, remembering. She found a stack of old class notes in the supply closet, and tucked between them was a folded piece of paper, a letter from Lauren. It read, "Mama M is more than breathing lessons. She's where I go when the world feels too loud." I read it twice, then slid it into a folder labeled History, not to forget, just to remind. By late afternoon, the mats were lined up. Just 6, but enough. I lit the vanilla candle I always used on Tuesdays. Lily stayed. So did a man named Peter. Said he used to come with his wife before she passed, and a woman named Denise. She didn't say much, just took off her shoes and sat in the front row.
We didn't do much. A few stretches, some breath work, but they listened. They remembered my voice. I went home with sore shoulders and a quiet heart. Just as I was boiling water for tea, the doorbell rang. It was a courier. Same young man who once brought flowers from Lauren after Zach's graduation. He said, "This needs a signature," and held out a padded envelope. I signed without asking. The return label was handwritten. It was Lauren's handwriting. I placed the envelope on the counter, but I didn't open it. Not yet. There's a rhythm to reclaiming. One breath, one note, one stretch at a time. The envelope was thick, heavier than it needed to be. Not the kind of weight that comes from paper, the kind that comes from guilt. I found it on my doormat just after 11. I had just made a cup of chamomile and turned the radio down, low enough to actually hear my own thoughts. Lauren's handwriting was still the same, too careful, like she practiced it for show and tell. I stared at it for a full minute before opening it with the edge of a butter knife. 4 pages, lined paper, faint smell of lavender. She used to say it reminded her of her grandmother. I never told her it reminded me of funeral homes. The first line read, "I thought you'd be too far gone to read this." Well, I wasn't, and with every sentence, I saw her more clearly than I ever had. She wrote about control, about how she watched her own mother fade, how helpless it made her feel. She said, "I promised myself I'd never let someone fall apart on my watch, even if I had to hold the pieces together myself." And for a second, I almost believed her. Until page 2. That's where the softness turned. She admitted to signing a few things in my name. To keep things moving, she wrote. Nothing dangerous. She called them maintenance choices, like I was just an old car sitting in her garage. She said Zach didn't know about all of it, that he thought he was helping, that he still believed I was just tired, not trapped. And then came the sentence I'll never forget. "You're not broken, just inconvenient." I read it twice, once with my heart pounding, once with dry eyes. That was her truth. Not the worry, not the sadness. That sentence. She'd made a calculation, and I didn't fit anymore. Walter knocked a little after midnight, said he'd made too much pie and figured I'd be awake. He didn't ask what I was holding, just handed me the plate, still warm, and said, "Apple cinnamon, like your birthday 2 years ago." After he left, I sat back down. The letter was still open. The tea had gone cold. Then I reached for the matches. I didn't burn it in anger. I watched the corners curl, like autumn leaves, and fall into the sink, one by one. She'd said her piece. That was enough. But I couldn't go to bed with her voice being the last one in the room. So I pulled out my own paper, cream-colored, heavy, the kind you save for something that matters. And I wrote a letter to myself, for 10 years from now,
For the days when my hands might tremble or my memory might slip. I wrote down what I remembered: the sound of Doug's laugh in the garden, the way my students bowed after class, the weight of the yoga mat slung over my shoulder the first time I taught alone. I didn't write about Lauren. At the very end, I signed my name in red ink, folded it once, sealed it with lavender tape, and tucked it behind the tea tins on the top shelf where I keep the good stuff. And in that quiet, I whispered to no one but myself, "They don't get the last word. I do." Some full circles don't get planned. You don't chase them. They just arrive, quietly, almost kindly. One morning, you tie your shoes and realize you're standing where it all began, only this time you're facing a different direction. The train station hadn't changed much, still smelled like cold metal and lemon cleaner. Same wooden bench near the vending machine, though the machine itself had been replaced with one that actually worked. A new potted plant sat in the corner, trying its best to feel permanent. But this time, I wasn't alone. Lily walked beside me, her overnight bag bouncing gently against her leg. She said, "They've got gluten-free muffins at the retreat. I checked." I smiled. Then it's a real yoga workshop. We were headed to a weekend session 2 towns over. Nothing fancy, just women like me, like Lily. Some older, some younger, some still figuring out where they ended, others just starting to remember where they began. I stood in line at the ticket counter, bought 2 tickets, no hesitation, no whispers behind me this time. I handed Lily hers and folded mine neatly into my pocket. Across the platform, I saw a woman fumbling with her purse. Her glasses were halfway down her nose. She looked familiar in that way we all do when we're just a little lost. I walked over, soft steps, and asked if she needed help. She said, "The schedule's blurry," squinting at the board. I pulled a pen from my bag. "Circle your time. That usually helps." She smiled, not embarrassed, just grateful. She said, "Thank you." When I turned back, Lily was watching me. She asked, "Are you okay being back here?" I looked around, at the tracks, the bench, the roof that still leaked in one corner. I took a breath and said, "This place doesn't own the memory. I do."
We boarded just before the whistle. I took the window seat. Spring light flickered past the trees. I reached for my journal, tucked between granola bars and old receipts. I flipped to a blank page. Names they gave me: forgetful, difficult, burden. Names I give myself: capable, persistent, present. The wheels clacked underneath us, steady and sure, carrying distance beneath our feet. I thought of Doug, of Sandra, of Walter's pie, of Zach, of Lauren. I didn't hold any of it too tightly. Some things need air if they're ever going to fade. Lily leaned over at one point and asked, "You writing your next workshop plan?" I shook my head. "Just a letter I'll read someday." And then I wrote one more line. They left me at a train station. I left them in the past. The tracks curved gently, carrying us somewhere new, somewhere I chose. I used to think closure meant something final, like a slammed door or a court ruling. But standing on that train, with my own name in my journal and sunlight warming my knees, I realized something else. Sometimes healing is just permission to own your story again. They tell us to be quiet as we age, to step aside with grace. But grace doesn't mean disappearing. Grace means strength, quiet, steady, remembered. And even if the world forgets your name for a while, that doesn't mean you forget who you are. If this story touched something in you, maybe a moment you reclaimed, or wish you had, I'd be honored to hear it. Leave me a comment, or share this with someone who'd understand. You're never as alone as you think. And if you're ready for what comes next, I hope you'll join me in the next story. It begins with these words. "My son said, 'I'm getting married tomorrow. Your car and house are sold.' Then called me an empty woman." It starts differently, but maybe, just maybe, ends with something stronger.